Before the Nazis took over Europe, deaf education was at its peak. In 1926, there were 73 schools for the deaf, 707 teachers of the deaf, and 6,149 documented deaf students. Oralism, the idea that the deaf should learn to speak in order to appear normal within the non-deaf world, was progressively rising during this time. The non-deaf world was finally determined to help the deaf become educated and therefore functioning members of their society. In 1932, a movie called Verkannte Menschen, or Misjudged People, was made. It featured deaf Germans and showed them in a positive light. The movie made use of sign language and captions and portrayed both oralism and signing. There were a variety of deaf clubs and gatherings. There were deaf sports teams and hiking groups. However, everything changed when Hitler took over. The law for prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases was issued by Hitler in 1933. This law was meant to prevent deaf people from passing on their deaf gene to future generations. It also applied to people with other disabilities. This law led to the sterilization of an unknown number of deaf Germans, who were among the 400,000 forcibly sterilized by the Nazi regime. In 1935, the law was expanded to include the termination of any deaf woman's pregnancy. Deaf organizations were subsumed into the Nazi Association of Deaf People, the REGEDE, the Reich Union of the Deaf of Germany. Many deaf people were forcibly sterilized, while others profited socially by supporting the Nazi effort and being ranking members of REGEDE. Many teachers at deaf schools turned in their students to be sterilized for social benefit. The idea that deaf children needed no education since they were inferior and it would be wasteful to educate them became prominent. In 1939, the Nazis began a program called T4, or Tiergartenstrasse 4, in which disabled people in Germany were murdered. Estimates suggest that at least 10,000 physically and mentally disabled German children perished as a result of the child euthanasia program during the war. Many of them had been sent to Nazi-run clinics by their parents, who were told that the Nazis were going to help their children. Then the children were killed, either by lethal overdoses of medicine, poison gas, or starvation. The same sorts of methods were applied in killing disabled adults. Two of the most notorious killing centers of the disabled were at Hartheim Castle in Austria and Hadamar. If a person was simply deaf, they would receive a mercy death where they would be injected with lethal doses of morphine or other drugs. But if they were also Jewish, they were denied a peaceful death because they were unworthy of the kindness. Deaf Jews and other disabled people suffered the same fate as hearing Jews in Nazi occupied Europe: discrimination, persecution, deportation, and mass murder. Along with deaf Germans, they were further targeted under Nazi policy. Many were unable to emigrate because of their deafness. It is important to note that Nazi Germany wasn't the only regime to practice the forced sterilization of disabled people, and it wasn't the first. There are many available deaf testimonies online of survivors who survived various camps and other situations, and I was lucky enough to be able to find many of them. So I have some personal stories from people's testimonies to share with you now. Morris Field, who managed to conceal his deafness, and he therefore was able to survive the war despite going through 5 concentration camps. Otto Veit was a man who owned a factory, and he was not deaf himself, but he went to substantial efforts to save the lives of 165 deaf and blind Jewish workers during this time, and was arrested many times by the Gestapo as a result. Ingelor Honigstein was the only deaf person in her family. She was Jewish and went to a deaf school until she was kicked out because she was Jewish, after which she went to a very small Jewish deaf school in Germany. She was able to find a small job as a house cleaner while she was there, and she ended up getting raped by Nazi youth also while she was at that school, and she fell pregnant as a result. Her family was able to move to America due to her having a cousin who lived in Atlanta, and she ended up aborting the pregnancy because she didn't want to bring a child into the world out of a situation as terrible as the one that it would have been born out of. I also had the privilege of talking to a woman named Janet Weinstock, whose mother, grandmother, and great uncle were deaf Jewish survivors. Her family lived in Vienna, and they had to move to a ghetto. When they could, they realized that something was going wrong, and they managed to get passports and escape to Italy via train, and then from Italy they got on a boat to America. However, due to their deafness, they were detained at Ellis Island for 5 months. Her family's names, her mother was Lily Ratner Sheary, her grandmother was Hilda Ratner, and her great uncle was Richard Weiner. Deaf Jews faced a lot of persecution during the Holocaust, doubly so because they were both deaf and Jewish. And it is very important for us to tell their stories.